My name is Edward Hedger. I'm very, very pleased to be chairing this final panel. We have 54 minutes to work out what we've made of the last 2 days and to try and turn this into something sort of practical and useful about what we take away from the last 2 days of the conference. Going to be ably assisted by 4 people who've been participating and speaking during the conference to help think about this future agenda and a bit of a stock take. If you remember back to the first session, we talked about what governments can do to learn from the past, what institutions and processes are need to invest in infrastructure and invest well to get this right. We'll look at the future agenda. So we're going to try and keep this discussion quite practical, quite focused. We've got 2 objectives, really. What's our stock take? What do we make of the material from the last couple of days? What are the practical propositions, the takeaways? And secondly, what's the future agenda? What hasn't been quite resolved? What hasn't come up that we need to think about more? And given that this is a research institute as well, what sort of research do we need to take forward? The sort of rules of the game are we're going to go across the panel and take some reflections from each of the 4 speakers, which will be their individual take, their personal take on what was interesting and what was important and what we should think about, particularly advice to governments who are trying to get infrastructure right and public investment right. Then we'll go out to the room, take some reflections and try and build an agenda. And by the end of it, I hope we'll have 5 to 10 good specific points. Well, we have a running order of Richard, Neil, Robert and Julia. So I think we'll probably run in that order, if that's all right. And I'll begin by turning over to Richard for his reflections.
Thank you, Edward, and thank you to you and the ODI and Kate for a really excellent conference. I've very much enjoyed the last 2 days. I think, unfortunately, after 2 days, I don't think we found the magic bullet for making public investment deliver all of people's dreams. But I think I'm glad that we haven't, because I think if we had, by the end of 2 days, found the magic bullet, it would almost certainly be a dud. And I think if you look back to the lessons of history and not repeating the mistakes of the past, if you look back sort of 30 years ago, I think we probably thought that we did have the magic bullet, which was get yourself a 5-year development plan, borrow some money from the World Bank or the IMF, and deliver all of your public investment through something called a Ministry of Public Works, who should finance it through a sinking fund used to meet all the capital costs. And I think what we've heard today, and I think reminded ourselves about, is just quite how difficult public investment can be, because public investment is quite different from the other kinds of expenditure that governments do. It is large. We're talking about big sums of money. It's lumpy, so you have big upfront costs. It's lasting, so you've got a legacy from the decisions that you make, which can last for 20, 50, 100 years, or in the UK, in the case of the UK's infrastructure, 400, 500 years. And it's linked. It's connected to everything else that governments do. And it depends on other decisions governments make about spatial planning, about enterprise policy, and about all the other decisions that governments have to make as part of their public policy choices. If you get it right, there are huge long-term economic and social benefits. But if you get it wrong, there are huge real but also large opportunity costs from those bad decisions. And I think if we're going to avoid the mistakes of the past, I think we also need to spend some time first understanding where weaknesses lie. And I think one of the things that I've really been struck by over the last 2 days is how diverse countries' problems are. You have some countries where there is a surfeit of financing but a dearth of good projects. You've got other countries where there is a surfeit of good projects but a dearth of financing. You've got some countries which have highly centralized revenues and not enough financing at the local level to meet local needs. But you've got other countries where they've so heavily decentralized financing, they don't have enough resources at the center of government or at the regional level to fund strategic projects. Some countries' investment budgets are plagued by under-execution. Other countries' budgets are characterized by massive overruns on big projects. And so I think to solve government's investment problems and enable them to invest more and invest better, I think you will first need to spend some time understanding the specific problems of specific countries. And from our part at the IMF and the World Bank, despite the fact the ODI always makes sure that there's at least two people in between us, we do in fact stand shoulder to shoulder in helping countries first and foremost to understand their strengths and weaknesses as public investors. And so I think one thing which we can offer as members of the international community is helping countries to diagnose their strengths and weaknesses. We've been developing something called the Public Investment Management Assessment, based on the work that we've both been doing in the area of public investment management, which helps countries to pinpoint where in the investment cycle do they have problems, gaps, bottlenecks, and then help them to think through what they can do to solve those problems. And I think a second thing which I've really been struck by over the last 2 days is quite how diverse the potential solutions now are compared to what countries were doing 30 years ago, when they were left with the legacy of bad practices they inherited from the UK Treasury, the French Ministry of Finance, and various other places, who left them with 5-year plans and ministries of public works and only one way of financing their infrastructure projects. And solving problems, may involve improving multimodal investment planning. It may be getting smarter about negotiating PPP contracts. It may involve setting up sovereign wealth funds of the sort that used to be anathema to institutions like the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF, but clearly can work if they're staffed by the right people, and lessons are learned from where they work. And I think the good news is that we've heard in the last few days some tremendous examples of innovative approaches to infrastructure finance, infrastructure management, infrastructure implementation, which work. And I think a great thing for me personally is what we've built here is a network of people who when I need a good engineer, when I need a good banker, when I need a good political scientist, or when I need a good economist, I've got a number of people who I can now get in touch with. And I think this a sort of network of people who are working on infrastructure, who have experience about what works in practice, and good stories to tell about how they've solved problems that countries have encountered along the way, is itself of tremendous value. So that's one thing I will certainly take away from this.
Great. Thank you very much. What we'll do is we'll sort of build this and we'll see which themes start to emerge across there. Some really helpful practical points as well as a reminder to avoid anything too generic or blueprint. Neil, over to you. We'll work sort of outside in, as it were.
Thank you very much. So I would like to go through 4, maybe 5 issues that I take away from this discussion and that I think we need to continue to think about as we go forward. The first is the point, and a very important point that was made about taking a comprehensive approach. My difficulty with a comprehensive approach is that it is never comprehensive enough. It is never the big picture, because all the things that we've listed as part of that comprehensive approach are the things that, if we think of this as what we can see as the top of an iceberg, all those things in the comprehensive approach lie above the waterline. What we need to also now start examining is all the things that lie below the waterline, the bottom part of the iceberg. And I think Amit's contribution that spoke about a bias in infrastructure investment in Kenya would certainly be one of those issues that would be lying below the waterline. And this is particularly true if we think of Africa not as a country but as a continent of 54 countries, where we saw the differences, the variations between Liberia and Ethiopia. I would imagine that if you throw Nigeria, South Africa, Togo, Benin, Egypt into that mix, that variation, that difference takes on a completely different perspective. So I think that it is a useful approach to say, let's consider the important things that we need to tick, but let's not forget that for each country there are things that are going to lie beneath the waterline that we also need to think of very carefully. The second point is that I think there are still lots of problems that we spoke about a lot in the past that are still with us. Corruption certainly being one of those. And unfortunately, that corruption is not only localized, it crosses borders. The big energy project in South Africa recently was named in a settlement between Hitachi and the SEC in the US, where Hitachi paid a $19 million fine, where they said they're not admitting guilt, but they're also not saying that they were not guilty or guilty. Yeah. And it was about an irregular payment that was paid to the ruling party in South Africa, or at least to the investment arm of the ruling party in South Africa, who obviously is believed to have influenced the decision about boilers that Hitachi had supplied to the coal-fired power station. So I think that these things, I mean, corruption is becoming a lot more sophisticated, and we shouldn't, move on as if it is no longer there. The third point is this idea that we should be getting things right the first time. I think it's fine as a desire, but it's a bit weird if we're going to be obsessing about it. I like the idea that if there are going to be new technologies, new capacities, and new types of financing, which we've been speaking about, that some of these projects we're going to have to, as Matt calls it purposive modeling. We're going to have to be allowed to make some mistakes and learn along the way. And as we learn new things, we can then take on a more structured approach. But I would imagine if we're going to try to get everything right the first time, that we're probably going to fall into the same or make the same mistakes of adopting best practices, of not being innovative, and probably stall on many of the projects that we should be undertaking. And then let me make the fourth point, my last point, and that is this thing about partnerships. It appears as if many of the partnerships that we're going to have to build are going to be partnerships that we are not very familiar with. Partnerships between states, the private sector, civil society, citizens, and matching those partnerships would have to be innovative financing. And I served for many years as South Africa's deputy to the ADF, and for 3 replenishment rounds we spoke about whether it is possible for an ADF country to partner in a project with a country that was borrowing non-concessionally from the African Development Bank, that may also throw a PPP into it, and whether multilateral development banks had the capacity to think out of the box, to think in this innovative way, so that these different partnerships that are required can take place. And then linked to this idea of partnerships is obviously, what I call to Inga or not to Inga. So, I no longer have any influence or any contribution to the debate any longer since leaving the National Treasury. But I'm at a point where I would like to say that we need to make up our minds if we're going to do Inga. If we can do Inga, then we should do Inga. And if we come to the conclusion that Inga is just too big, then we should stop speaking about Grand Inga. One of the countries, the second biggest economy in Africa, South Africa, probably has to be part of Grand Inga. But South Africa now seems to be intent on nuclear, $100 billion worth of nuclear that it seems as if it's going to purchase. If that happens, then I think we can count South Africa out of Grand Inga. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll move straight on. It's interesting, we're getting some principles, but also some caveats and some cautions emerging as well, which I think is important, so we'll pick those up. Robert, let's take your reflection, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. 3 quick things, actually. One, and this is homage to Philip, to go back to the basics. and to restate that institutions do matter and will continue to matter. And I think this is important to say because not only because we have evidence from the work Richard and my friend Anna and others have done, which shows that the institutional environment really impacts the quality of public investments, but also because it's very long term, it's very contextual, and we just need to keep focused on that. Now, the question I think on this is then, since projects are going to be happening as we focus on the long term building of institutions, how do we mitigate the risks of failure, especially in places where institutions are challenged? And what are the techniques and approaches that that will help us avoid failure, and especially on the implementation and maintenance side? I think we've talked a lot about the upfront pieces, both the planning and the design. My sense is that not enough on actually the mechanics of implementation, especially on the asset management side. So, I mean, I think that's part of the question, and here I think there's a couple of things we've talked about. One is this whole idea of bringing innovations, including to my hobby horse of procurement, really thinking and learning, especially from the private sector. I think we can learn a lot. So that government doesn't always have to do things the way traditionally they have done them. I think there's a whole question on the accountability side around what I call radical openness. I think on infrastructure side, we still have pockets of kind of darkness and secrecy. And I've mentioned contracts before, and I'll keep mentioning contracts as a main issue. We do need to bring combined efforts to really push the agenda forward. Two, very quickly, is it was called investing in investing. I think if we're talking about the future, we really have to think very creatively how we put massive resources in investing in national and regional capabilities. I mean, it is not a mistake that Mamadu's initiative is succeeding. Is because of the focus that they've had on building the capacity there to actually get the things they need to do. It's not by accident. And I think as we get into these more complicated contracting mechanisms, the need for more complex partnerships, the capacity on the state side to manage all these things, especially when it's faced on the other side by highly paid lawyers, financial engineers, the capacity of the state really to be able to do is something we have to invest in very deliberately in a very focused way. And finally, I mean, one of the things I keep thinking about is that I think we need to keep reminding ourselves that finally it's about the people. And it's very cliche, so to uncliche it, I'll tell you the story of my father. So my father lives in rural Kenya. He's a rural elite. He's a retired bureaucrat. And there's this one road he uses, so he lives in a small town. And he has a farm where he goes to inspect his cattle and whatever else he does there. And there's a road he uses every other day to get to his farm. And the other day I was visiting him, and we went together to the farm, and I noticed that they were upgrading sections of this road. So I said, you're a user of this road. Do you know where the money came from? Who decided which sections are to be upgraded and why sections? Who is even the contractor? And he was quite embarrassed that he did not have this information. So what I have done is I've created a monster because my father now has become a busybody of harassing everybody about local infrastructure and forming local committees to inspect the books and everything else. Now, two stories there. One is that finally it's about the people. It's about people like my father who will benefit from this. But secondly, that if government is to create trust with citizens, it really must have a way of getting citizens to know what it is they're getting, where they're getting it, who is doing it, where is the money coming from, coming back to my point of radical openness. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A nice story of individual activism as well as some systemic issues to pick up with. Let's take your points, Julia, and then we'll throw all this out to the room and see what everyone makes of this. We're convinced.
Okay, I've got the similar 3 to 4 points, and as I say, it's a difficult story to follow.
Yeah.
Don't have anything quite that good, but I think the reflections that I have is that I've been impressed about the extent to which this conference is discussing processes, discussed how things develop rather than just financing. There are many conferences I've been where the focus has been on financing. The idea is if you throw enough money at something, something will come out of it. Roads will be built, power stations will be created. And the discussion here has been much more about how the move really from initial concept into creation and how that is going to be achieved. And as part of that, I was particularly delighted to hear, certainly this afternoon, the comments about the engineers. Infrastructure doesn't create itself. It's picking up the last point. It's to do with people who have contracts, who build, who go out, who do things on time, who don't do things on time. And sometimes, again, that's a very critical element, and I think we miss out when we're talking about sort of flows of money, and really hearing more about that was very heartening. And in that context as well, I think I'd also like to add that one of the things that when I'm in the 21st century, there's Twitter, there's Facebook, there's LinkedIn. We have enormous capacity for communication. And one of the areas that we can grow knowledge networks is by talking to one another, by sharing experiences, sharing ways of doing things. And I think that whole knowledge, and Gordon Brown talked about it yesterday, and I think it's that whole capacity building is not in that element now of just individual training, that one person gets in front of 20, but it's actually how we dissipate the knowledge that we are getting from what works and what doesn't work. And just as a final point, and just keeping that communication point going, which I think is a very important one, there's this sense in a way that private and public, and I think one of the speakers referred to it, must be kept apart, that in a way if they get anywhere close to one another something horrible is going to happen. And I think again we've got to move on from that. I don't just mean it in a financing sense of a public-private partnership, but actually bringing the public and the private sectors together again to promulgate good practice, to make sure that where there are issues that the public sector are chewing over as to whether or not this is going to work, if I put it out there, will it get any money, or if I put that risk out there, it's much better to have a dialogue up front than to have an egg throwing contest later.
Right. Thank you
comments.
very much. Well, it seems a lot of agreement, a lot of convergence. A real sort of partnership across the panel, in fact, and these principles resonate. It's we talked about the variation. We were talking about sort of everything being complicated. I think we've had complex as well as complicated to that list. Diversity of solutions. The same time, partnerships, the variation in terms of what we don't know, and knowledge and people. What I want to do is throw this out the room a little bit now and get a lot of points. We're not going to take questions from the panel. We've had plenty of time for questions. We want positive points. You've all sat here, contributed, listened, spoke at various points. So we'll take quite a lot around. We can keep intervention short. What we're really interested in is either the really pithy reflection from the last couple of days, what's the thing that you take away that can help us practically advance this agenda? And especially this conference is framed partly around infrastructure, but also around public investment and what governments are doing and how governments can get public investment infrastructure right. So what do we, if you're a government official or a politician, what have you taken that you do if you're someone who works with or advises or researches? What are the practical points? What are the practical reflections? If we've got a couple of roving mics, I hope, just take out hands and we'll try and get maybe a dozen quick points and see where we end up. Let's start. You start from right to start from right to left.